Deanna, we can't hear you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our study to the ends of the earth. We are in lesson 10 this week, and we are at Paul and the series of 3 trials before Felix, Festa, and Agrippa, or 3 responses. I don't know. The last one may be more of a show than a trial, but we see Paul making his defense. So someone remind us where we were last week. Where did we leave Paul? We saw him transitioning from all of his missionary journeys and making the journey to Jerusalem. And then what happened with him in Jerusalem?
He was accused by the crowd, and especially by some people that had come from Ephesus, and was in chains. But the commander who has him in chains lets him speak to the crowd, and then he speaks to the Sanhedrin. A plot to kill Paul was discovered, and they are whisking him off to Caesarea.
Yeah. Okay. Great summary. Great summary. So he is supposed to make this demonstration of respect for the law, right? And so he's purified himself, and he's in this period of purification, but he doesn't get a chance to do it. Instead, these Jews from, it says Asia, and we think they're probably from Ephesus, the capital of the province of Asia. And they start stirring up. They're saying, oh, we bet he brought a Gentile into the temple. This is the one who speaks against our people and the law and this place, the temple. They're very upset at the challenge to the temple and the authority of the temple and the meaning of the temple. And so there is a riot. And with this riot, the Roman commander, who's just right there on this tower at the northwest corner of the temple, they rush right down and intervene and arrest Paul. And so he is on trial for other people beating him, which is, sort of representative of how this justice is going to go as we look through today's lesson. Okay, so today we're starting chapter 24. We see that Paul has successfully been moved to Caesarea despite the plot against him. And the governor is Felix. Now, Felix has quite a reputation. And I want to read you an excerpt because the way this was written, I really enjoyed it. I thought I would read it to you instead of paraphrasing. So, Felix, the Roman procurator of Samaria and Judea, it's an official Roman title, did not have a stellar reputation. He had been a slave and was freed by the mother of the emperor Claudius. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, Felix, with all cruelty and lust, wielded the power of a king with the mentality of a slave. Opinions about Felix's rule are almost universally negative, stressing his harshness and notoriously incompetent administration, which led to violent unrest. So several uprisings occurred during his term. There were riots in Caesarea. We're going to talk about one of those riots because it happens during the 2 years that Paul is in custody, that there is this uprising, and his response is so brutal that a delegation of Jews traveled to Rome to bring charges in Rome against Felix for his bad governance. So it's very interesting. He's able to escape punishment because of who he knows. He has connections. His brother Pallas was secretary of the treasury for just barely enough time to get Felix out of trouble, but he ends up being recalled from his position because of the unrest during his term. His wife, Drusilla, was known to be very beautiful. She was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I. And Josephus writes about how Felix went to great efforts to seduce her away from her first husband, as is this king of Emesa in Syria. So he is not her first husband, and she is his third wife. Drusilla was one of these 3 queens that Felix married, one of whom was the granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra. So these are people with powerful connections across the Roman world, and yet we see there are these levels of incompetence and poor behavior, immorality in them. Questions or comments on that? That was a lot of information I kind of just threw at you.
It sounds kind of familiar.
Okay, say more about that. Just this is the way that that human authorities often go. Yeah. It says that Felix traded on the influence of his brother Pallas, and it calls infamous, and indulged in every license and excess, thinking he could do any evil act with impunity. And that is from Tacitus, the Roman historian, right? So, that's not even according to a Jewish standard of morality. That's according to the much more liberal Roman standard of morality, right?
Politics hasn't changed, has it? It's always been the same.
In some ways, maybe that's discouraging, but maybe it's also encouraging, because we see God working here in the midst of this corruption.
Yeah, greed for power takes all kinds of forms.
Yes.
And God can use that greed to bring out good in other people.
A point that I think we really do see it coming out of today's scripture. Yeah. Let's read Acts 24, 1-9. So keep in mind Felix's character and his reputation for governance as we read this. And someone go ahead and read those first 9 verses of Acts 24, please.
"5 days after the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all of these charges we are bringing against him." The Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true.
Thank you. Loretta, I'm sorry, I saw that you had started to read too late, but you were muted, so next time. Great. Okay, so Acts 24, who arrives in Caesarea?
Ananias?
Yeah, this is the high priest. And what altercation did Paul have with him last? Look back at the very beginning of chapter 23.
In Caesarea, in Jerusalem, he was one of the accusers.
Yes.
I guess the main accuser.
Well, he was the leader because he's the high priest. And what? Look at 1-4. What happens with them?
Well, he was ordered to strike him on the mouth.
Yeah, Ananias is the one who orders that. And then Paul calls Ananias what?
You whitewashed wall?
Right. So this would be an expression of hypocrisy, right? Of saying like that you are trying to look pure, but you are inside your evil, right? So this is not a small charge, especially one to make to the high priest. And Paul says, well, I didn't know he was the high priest. And so, they have this interaction, but it has to be personal for Ananias at this point with his challenge to his authority and his morality and his ability to lead the people, right? So this party of Jews includes the high priest Ananias himself. And, one time last week we talked about when he was going to make this show of respect for the law. This was James and company's idea for him to kind of resolve the question about Paul's respect for the law with Jesus believing Jews. But with the way that this has progressed, what we're getting is a party of Jews that are not Jesus believers, right? That comes out quite clearly in the progression of the trial. So that all the Jews, sometimes in Acts will refer to Jesus believing Jews, sometimes we'll refer to not Jesus believing Jews. And here in this section, this is all not Jesus believing Jews. Okay, who is Tertullus? Why do they have him?
Says he's an attorney.
Yeah, an advocate, an attorney. Literally, he's a rhetorician, an orator. These are experts in Jewish law, these Ananias and the other high priests who come, but they are not experts in Roman law. And so they hire an advocate or an orator to interact, a lawyer to interact with them with the Roman court. Latin was the official language of the courts. And a judge could grant that the proceedings be conducted in Greek, which all these, Greek is the common language. It is particularly the Koine Greek that the New Testament is written in, is a language that's common to all these people that don't necessarily know each other's home languages, native area languages, but the courts were in Latin. And so they couldn't necessarily guarantee that they could even speak the language unless they happened to speak Latin. And some scholars think that Tertullus's little speech reads like a translation from Latin. So it may be that that's part of why they need an advocate. They don't want to take chances at a disadvantage, either in Roman law or possibly in language. So what do we think of Tertullus's opening address to Felix?
Don't you find it interesting that he's really brown nosing there?
It's really noticeable, isn't it?
Yeah. So we'll listen to him.
It's like if we thought Felix was a good governor, we would go, But now knowing that he's like notoriously bad at governance and notoriously harsh and evil, and licentious, like all the things that we've learned about him, we go like, ooh, this speech, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like he really wants to get his attention, make sure he listens to him.
Yes, yeah, really trying to hit that flattery button to try to make his case more appealing. Yeah. What are the charges that they bring against Paul through Tertullus?
Profaning the temple.
Yes, that's one of them.
Inciting riots.
Yeah, they call
Disturbances.
Disturbances. What does your translation say? Troublemaker? What does it call it?
Mine says troublemaker.
Troublemaker. Any others?
Mine is pestilent fella.
A plague.
A plague. Okay, this is literally, he is a pestilence or a plague, right? So the meaning is troublemaker, and maybe the implication of using that word for pestilence or plague is that the trouble, like kind of riotous trouble, is bound to spread like a disease, right? Calling him a troublemaker may sound a little toothless, but it's targeting something that's quite important to the Romans. They prided themselves on the Pax Romana. Caesar proclaimed himself the Prince of Peace, and keeping peace was done, by harsh military measures, but it was still their priority, right? This goes back to why Paul was the one arrested, even though he was the one being attacked, right? People are beating him and they arrest him. Why? It's because troublemaking is a serious charge. So the Roman lawyer is aiming for that sensitivity. This is a way of charging him with insurrection.
Says he's a ringleader too.
Okay, a ringleader of what?
Of the sect of the Nazarenes.
Okay, so this is a way of charging heresy. right? So they're saying that he is participating, or more than participating, leading this heresy within Judaism. This is the only use of the word Nazarene like this in the New Testament. This seems to have been a Jewish designation for Christians in the way that Christians, that word was used in Antioch among some of the Gentiles. This word Nazarene became a common title, as common as Christians in the West, in the East. So in the East, may be known as Nazarenes; in the West, may be known as Christians. You notice Paul avoids both of those, and he calls it the way, right? Paul's avoidance is very specific, and we'll talk about that some more. But they say he's a ringleader of this sect. Oh, someone spoke?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, was that kind of a negative to call him the Nazarene sect? Was that kind of a slur a little bit?
So, well, Nazarenes are not regarded well, but I think the what they're aiming at is the charge of heresy.
Yeah.
Within Judaism. Now, what's the problem with the charge of heresy within Judaism? From the accuser's point of view, what's the problem with that charge?
Well, for one thing, they would be leading the people away from Moses, from the Mosaic law. That would be heresy. You just don't do that.
Right, and that is what they think Paul is doing, and that's why it's so serious to them. But how would the Romans have looked on that kind of charge?
It could be very well a political movement that would, really cause a civil war or whatever,
Right, which they care about. So that goes back to that charge of insurrection. But within the charge of heresy, we see that they don't really want to adjudicate between religious matters that are in amongst the people, right? They're like, if this is, we hear Festus saying this later, like, they didn't charge him with anything I expected. It was like some religious matter within their own law, right? So remember when Paul was in front of Gallio and the Jews charged him with things, and Gallio said, this is an internal matter for Judaism. This has nothing to do with me. So their charge has kind of I think the tactics may have backfired on them a little bit, in that the accusers think, oh, this is important, this is heresy. But the Romans, they may think like, oh, this is an internal matter of Judaism. And so this really may play in Paul's favor, right? Okay, so 2 charges: insurrection, heresy, and then what's the third one? I think someone already said it, but remind us.
Desecrating the temple.
Yeah, it's noticeable that they say he tried to desecrate the temple, right? I don't know if there's really a try, like either you desecrate the temple or you don't desecrate the temple. And the other problem with this charge is, if Trophimus had been in the interior temple courts, who would have been liable for that? Who would have been subject to death for being in the temple courts?
Trophimus, I guess.
Yes, Trophimus himself. It was the person, the Greek who has, remember we talked about the sign is posted in Greek, he shall be responsible for his ensuing death, right? Like Trophimus himself would be liable for that charge, not Paul, right? So there's a weakness in that charge as well. But those are the 3 charges: insurrection, heresy, and profaning the temple, or defiling the temple, right? And notice this is, everybody's got their spin, right? Talk about politics never changing. They claim to have arrested him when really there was just, an explosion of mob violence, right? And what kind of evidence do they present? What kind of witnesses do they present?
They didn't have any evidence.
No, they present nothing in that realm, right? Everybody agrees, yeah, that's really true. It really is. but they don't have evidence. They don't have the witnesses. So let's read Paul's response in 10 through 27, please. Larry, do you want to read that? I'll unmute you. Oh, you're going to have to do it yourself.
I
There you go.
it on my iPad and it keeps my Bible on my iPad and it keeps doing things that I don't want it to do. We're starting with verse 10.
10 through 27, please.
Okay, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. If you can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship, my accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or somewhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law, and that is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God as those men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance, but there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. Then, how long do I go? Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings.
Go ahead and finish that chapter.
When Lysias, the commander, comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison.
Thank you. Okay. So how much flattery does Paul include?
They're all kind
Not
of
much. A little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of the bare civility, right? We have this, I think it shows a real contrast between the maybe points of integrity here, right, in their defense, right? What does Paul call his answer to the charges?
What does he call them?
Mm-hmm.
I just read that.
I will gladly make
My defense.
Yeah, we talked about this word defense as a key word through this section where Paul is answering charges towards himself. He's testifying, but he's also giving a defense of the gospel, right? A testimony to Jesus Christ. And this is kind of this section theme, right? His testimony to Jesus Christ here. And so he gives, and we talked about those 3 charges, right? And he answers all 3 of those charges, but it's a little buried in kind of a story, and we have to dig it out, right? So verse 11, what was Paul's purpose in Jerusalem?
Bring money for the people who were hungry.
Okay, he does mention that. He talks about giving the offering and the alms for the poor, right? What does he give us his overarching purpose in verse 11?
To worship.
Yeah, in a way, this is the foundation for his answer for all three of these charges, right? He's there for worship. So the charge of insurrection, it's not insurrection, but reverence, right? The charge of heresy, it's not heresy, it's actually conformity. He's worshiping, and he's going to talk more about that. And is he profaning the temple? No, exactly the opposite. Worshiping, right? So how does he specifically answer the charge of insurrection? Start in verse 12, and then there's a couple other little pieces.
Wasn't he by himself?
That wasn't
Right,
it.
he says he was what?
Wasn't he by himself? So, wait. They didn't find him disputing anything.
Right. So I don't know, he could have been with people, but he's not doing what?
Not
Arguing with anyone.
Right? He's not stirring up trouble. It says that Paul, and then later in verse 18, what does he say?
That he was ceremonially clean.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, he does. And what charge is that in answer to?
Profaning the temple?
Yeah. Right. So he's speaking to that one when he talks about being ceremonially clean, right? In verse, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and here it says he's not with anyone or with troubles.
Right. There's no crowd with me, nor was I involved in a disturbance, right? So he's answering that charge of insurrection, say, I wasn't arguing, wasn't stirring up trouble, I wasn't having a crowd, I wasn't creating a disturbance. And then how about heresy? What does he say in regard to heresy? Look particularly at verse 14.
That he believes in the law and he believes in the prophecies.
Yeah. He admits he's a worship of the God, verse 14,
of our fathers.
Of our fathers, right? So he believes it's the same God, the God of our fathers, and he does everything in accordance with the law, and it's written in the prophets, right? Which he talks about, these men cherish themselves. So he's pointing out that they really have this same faith in God in common, right? He believes the same things they do, which has this double advantage of answering the charge of heresy, right? But also keeping the dispute within the realm of how the Jewish faith is understood or practiced, right? Which the Romans don't want to get into.
Is
Mary.
Ananias a Sadducee or a Pharisee?
He would be a Sadducee. The
That's what-
Sadducees were the, so yes, there's a
That's
little.
why he's more stirred up about this, I guess.
Maybe, and it's probably why he was stirred up when Paul was in front of the Sanhedrin, right? Paul immediately proclaims, well, I believe in the resurrection. And then, you get the back and forth about the resurrection. We have the non-resurrection party are the ones who come to continue the accusation. The Sadducees were a sort of aristocratic group that were in control of the high priesthood. And so they were cooperative with Rome in a lot of ways. It was a kind of a go along to get along mentality among the Sadducees. The fact that they didn't believe in resurrection was part of their sort of understanding of the Torah, but they also had this like partnership with the Romans that allowed them to retain the power of the temple authority.
And sometimes you wonder, or at least I do, I guess it's because my distrust of politics, but anyway, sometimes you wonder if the Sanhedrin just used this charge of about the resurrection as just a stepping stone to hide their real motives of keeping their place in the political world. That's been used over and over by all kinds of people looking for power and position. They just take a popular something or other, but their real agenda is something else for them, for themselves, power for themselves.
I think Luke implies that. I think that what you're picking on up on is the intent of the authors to see as we go Jesus in his trial. You know, it talks about them being jealous of him and being threatened by him, and then this just sort of continues through the book of Acts. So, yeah, absolutely. This idea that those in power want to keep their power, and that the justice is not as just as they might claim, right? Don't we have a contrast in justice here?
Sure.
The Roman Jewish justice failed Jesus and failed Paul here, and then we go into Roman justice, and we'll talk about how that turns out. But I mean, not very just. Yeah, a stepping stone to some kind of political gain, personal gain. We'll talk about that as we close this section with Felix here. Yeah. Okay, so Paul answers the charge of insurrection, that he was not stirring up trouble, the charge of heresy, that actually he believes in the same God that they do, and he believes in the law and the prophets. And he uses this point to make the point that Jesus is the culmination of everything that God has been doing in Israel and with Israel, right? That is part of one of those themes of Acts, is that Jesus is the result of the truth of the law and the prophets. Okay, how does he the charge of profaning the temple, we talked about that. He says he was keeping his conscience clear. He always keeps his conscience clear. He says he's undergone the rites of purification, like you pointed out, and then he says he was bringing those offerings, like Dia mentioned. He's giving, not offerings. And then what is his complaint? He makes some legal complaints about his accusers and the accusations. Verse 19, what does he say?
Why they weren't there, that they should be there to voice the accusations and prove the accusations there.
Yeah, so Roman law expected accusers to be present to make their accusations. Right. And Paul points out that his original accusers were these Jews from Asia, probably Ephesus, who had first accused him and then not stayed to make their charges. Of course, the Jews didn't point to those people because they didn't have them on hand to make their charges. So, Paul is sort of breaking up their case in that way. And then verse 20, he says, look, my appearance before the Sanhedrin was an official inquiry, because remember who brought him to the Sanhedrin for that discussion?
The commander?
Yeah, the Roman commander brought him. And so that was an official part of his inquiry, and it found nothing. He's saying, so he's kind of appealing to he's saying, look, the lower court than here, right? This would be like an example of like a lower court, higher court situation. He's like, I'm in the higher court now. The lower court already couldn't find a charge against me, and yet kept charging me and sent me to the higher court. Right. So you see, and this is the pattern, right? He's not found guilty, and yet he continues being tried. Questions or comments on this section? So let's look at verse 22. What does it say about Felix? What does he know?
He was well acquainted with the way.
Yeah, why would he be well acquainted with the way?
Possibly because of his wife, maybe, who was a
Yeah.
Jew.
Yes, Drusilla is Jewish. I mean, she's semi-Jewish, right? She wouldn't be like full practicing Jew, it doesn't seem. And yet she's of Jewish heritage through Herod Agrippa I, and she may be Felix's source. also, Romans had an efficient spy network on the lookout for sedition and on the lookout for any factious groups that could cause unrest. So he probably also knows about the way from the spy network. And it says that he, questions, comments?
I just thought it was funny. Just giggling.
Yeah,
like here.
it is quite entertaining, right? There's quite a drama here. It says that he adjourned. This is a technical term that Roman judges used when they could not make a judgment without further inquiry. And he says that he'll call Lysias the commander, right? But do we ever hear of Lysias being called? That thread just kind of tapers off, right? We don't get any follow-up on that. So he adjourns and changes Paul's status to what the Romans called free custody. He could have friends visit him and attend to his needs, which is very good, because when you're in Roman custody, they don't do that. You know, you don't have permission to get your needs tended to, you don't get your needs tended to. So he has a more comfortable situation from that point. And then in verse 24, so we learn later that quite frequently Felix hears from Paul. And so this is one of the situations, one of the occasions on which he hears from Paul. And Felix and Drusilla listen to him in verse 24. How did they react to his sermon? Well, what does he talk about? What does Paul talk about?
Subject of faith in Christ Jesus.
Faith in Christ Jesus, and he discourses on
Righteous
Judgment to come.
judgment.
Yeah, righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. What did Felix and Drusilla say to that?
They're afraid.
Alarmed. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes them afraid. Why? I keep saying Drusilla like it's a Spanish pronunciation. I'm quite sure it's Drusilla. I just am pronouncing it wrong. Sorry about that. Why are they afraid?
It talks about the judgment to come, and Felix hasn't been very stellar.
Yeah. Nor Drusilla, who was enticed away from her husband and is, you know, they have some problems in the righteousness category, and they know it.
They hadn't read Revelations yet either.
Yes, no, they hadn't read it because it hadn't been written. So
no.
yes, very good point. Yeah.
I don't understand why Felix kept calling him back.
Okay, why does he keep calling him back?
He wants money. I mean,
Yeah,
Yeah, it says he's hoping
besides the
for bribes.
bribes.
Yeah, this was illegal, but not uncommon. And Felix may have been thinking of Paul's contribution that he brought with him that he mentioned, right? So he's hoping for a bribe. Why else does he keep calling him back?
Well, I wondered if he was wanting to hear more about Jesus.
Yeah, we get an
Learn.
echo here. Remember how Herod kept Paul in, John the Baptist in prison, but he wanted to hear from him. And so we would bring him out and listen to him. We get a real echo here. We get a sense that maybe there's a fascination with the message, or the message is somehow speaking to him.
I want the hope of forgiveness.
There you go. I mean, Paul's message, he preaches it as good news, right? There is a point of, yes, there's a judgment to come. You know, when he's standing in front of Athens in their highest court of judgment, he says there is a greater judgment. God will judge truly. And so Felix is there with what he knows is unjust judgment. And there's this idea of judgment to come, but all threaded through is the fact that God wants you, right? This is good news. God is seeking you. The God that maybe you thought was only interested in Jews is actually interested in you too.
And when Paul tells his story, he was not a good person before his vision. And he had changed so completely and was so convicted of the resurrection and the forever. And that just his own personal experience would be a testimony that people go, well, maybe there's something to this.
Yeah. Although I think that Paul, talking about Paul being a good person or not, he talks about how persistent he was with persecuting the Christians and how he was obsessed, some translations say. But he was doing that in the name of good, right? He just didn't understand what good was at that point, right? So it wasn't a case of moral failure, but a case of having to be aligned with what the real truth is in God.
But that could also be the Roman rulers thinking they're doing for a just cause.
Great point.
And so I wonder that they saw similarities between Paul and themselves, and just wondering what to do for themselves at this point.
Yeah, and such a big change, right? And he's not talking about it here. We'll get to that as he talks in front of Agrippa, but he's told this story, and it's been clear, that his change was immediate and profound. Yeah. So, and it's clear that he uses that to say, like, this Jesus is real, and so he may have told it with Felix and Drusilla, and so they, I think they keep calling. They want the bribe. They want to. There's one more reason. What's the other issue for Felix? Why does he leave Paul in prison?
He wants to do a favor for the Jews.
Yeah, during, we have historical sources. This is in Josephus, I think there's some of this in Tacitus, I can't remember. But there are historical sources that during Paul's imprisonment, another one of these disturbances broke out. The Jews the current mood among Jewish culture at that time was one of inflamed nationalism. And so another disturbance broke out to the point that there was fighting in the streets between Jews and Greeks. And in the end, Felix lost patience and suppressed it with such violence that the outraged Jews who had suffered the most at the hands of his soldiers were able to go to Rome, present their case, and force his recall. And so he has political problems, and he's trying to mitigate them by doing the Jews a favor here, right? So that was the other, and we really get a picture of the justice, Jewish justice versus Roman justice versus God's true and final justice to come. Thoughts on that?
I have read that even before Christ came in, before Jesus came into the picture, there was this very delicate balance between the Roman rulers of Jerusalem and Caesarea and that area. Very delicate balance between that and keeping peace with the Jews. And they were willing to do things they really didn't feel were right in order to keep that peace at all costs, because history had shown that their predecessors had been kicked out. And they might not be able to keep their jobs for very long if they couldn't take care of these Jewish uprisings. So they were really walking a tightrope in a lot of ways and trying to decide what they should do or shouldn't do. I feel sorry for them, but they were kind of caught.
Think about Pilate in that respect, right? Pilate said, I don't think this is right, but he did it anyway. Washed his hands of this man. Right? And yet he went ahead and ordered his execution because of this sort of this situation of just on the brink, uprising constantly on the brink. We see it in 100 different ways, like in the fact that the Roman tower is on high alert always during festival, so that as soon as there's a little mob action, they run right down and grab Paul. Like, there's just so many ways that we see this as an issue.
Yeah, there was a lot of passing the buck too. They didn't want to deal with it, so they'd wait till the next person came in, or they would send him to another city, so somebody else had to deal with it.
Yeah, later when Festus kind of the conversation between Festus and Agrippa has a lot of self-justification in it, right? Self-defense, like it really wasn't my fault that my predecessor left him and I tried him right away. And, you know, so there's just a lot of like, look, I'm doing my best here. Yeah.
And on the other hand, I found it interesting, the similarities. The Jews, their solution to problems was to kill him. They wanted to kill Paul. They killed Jesus. You know, if we kill him, then we don't have any problems. So let's just kill them all off.
If they don't agree with you, just do away with the problem and then it goes away.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways we see that like they were maybe supposed to stone people who were leading them away from God. And so, yeah. Okay, let's look at chapter 25. So the trial before Festus follows some of the same lines as the trial before Felix, doesn't it? Right? We see that again, the Jews are plotting an ambush. They want to kill Paul by ambush. And there's these, if we take Paul's answer to them, let's look in verse 7. When Paul appeared, the Jews came down from Jerusalem, stood around him, bringing many serious charges, again, which they could not prove, again. And Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. Same 3 charges in different order, right? This is heresy, desecration, insurrection. Right? Same 3 charges that he's speaking to. And again, verse 9, Festus, what?
Wanted to do the Jews a favor.
Yeah, his predecessor has been recalled for handling these situations poorly. We might want to do them a favor. We might want to read as avoid a riot by them, right? So he's trying to kind of, cover all his bases, keep the peace, but you can tell that he doesn't hold with transferring Paul to Jerusalem because he originally answers the Jews, no, you can come to Caesarea. But then he's like trying to do them a favor. So he asks Paul, what would it be okay with you, Paul, if, verse 9,
We go to Jerusalem.
right? Which he might even suspect is a trap, right? It's happened before. And what does Paul do in response?
He appeals to Caesar.
Yeah, this is a deeply dramatic moment in the book of Acts, isn't it? This is a judicial right of all Roman citizens, but it was risky. Caesar did not like to hear random trials by unknown commoners, right? This is not something that was desirable for Caesar to have to hear this. And so this is a risk Paul is taking. There were also, during this period, there had been put additional restrictions on appeals to Caesar, the details of which have been lost. So we don't know exactly what the legal, minutia is here. We see that Festus goes and consults with his counselors to see what he needs to do. And he comes back and he says, no, this is an appeal that stands to Caesar, you will go. This would have been Nero early in his reign when he was not yet known for the cruelty that we see later.
Deanna?
Yes.
I just remembered that, remember back in chapter 23, that Jesus had told Paul that he was going to take his case to Rome. So, I mean, it's probably not a surprise that he appealed to Caesar.
Yeah, he's been in custody for 2 years and more, right? To the way the 2 years can mean like into the second year in the way that they counted time, but Luke uses a phrase in the fullness of 2 years. So it's probably been more than 2 years, 2 years under Felix, and then this Festus has come on scene. And so we see Paul is finally making this appeal. Yeah. And maybe at the prompting of the Spirit, especially he talks later, we'll see in next week's lesson, we do the ship voyage, and he'll say that God told me I had to testify in Rome and that I'm going to make it to Caesar. So, you know, maybe the prompting of the Spirit, he appeals to Caesar. Other thoughts? So after this point, we get the third and final of these three, you know, sort of hearings. King Agrippa is the son of Herod Agrippa I, and he's with his sister Bernice, who was the oldest of, you know, Drusilla was the youngest, Bernice was the oldest. She was married at the age of 13 to her uncle, Herod of Chalcis, and following his death, she lived with her brother, which gave rise to rumors of an incestuous relationship between them. And to allay these rumors, she married this other king, Polemon, king of Cilicia, but soon left him to return to her brother's household. So she lives in her brother's household. These are three siblings. Drusilla, Agrippa, and Bernice are siblings and well acquainted with Judaism. So they come to court. It says that they're coming for to greet him. This is an official, looks like an official visit as the king to this governor. And they're going to have an audience with Paul. Let's look at verse 23. Who is the audience now? Who all is there?
The chief captains, the principal men of the city, and Paul.
So this is a much larger group, right? It says that they enter. How do Agrippa and Bernice enter?
Great pumped.
Yeah, so it's almost less like a trial and more like a show, right? A gala performance of Roman justice is the way one commentator put it, right? So they're going to have, it'll be a big day of entertaining various issues or events, and one of them is going to be hearing from Paul. So all through chapter 26, I wish we had time to read it. We don't. But what do you notice about Paul gives this speech in chapter 26? What do you notice about it?
Well, it's similar to his other speeches about his conversion, how he was faithful, how his education, and how he was strong Jewish, and then you know, Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and how his life was changed, and how he's been teaching about Christ ever since.
Yeah, he follows this pattern of his zealousness and the complete change that his meeting with Jesus made in him. He gives the story of conversion. This is the third telling of his story of conversion in Acts. Just as it's the third trial and the third speech in his defense, right? This is kind of the high point of the speeches in Acts. It's the most polished. It has an elaborate style in Greek. And we get kind of Paul's the fullness of his message here, right? We heard in Pisidian Antioch, we heard like his classic sort of message for the Jews. We got his message for the Greeks, maybe in Athens, combination maybe between Thessalonica and Athens, or no, the place where they tried to sacrifice him, wherever that was. You guys remember the event, if not the town name. And then, you know, the speech on the beach with the leaders of Ephesus, we get kind of a message for Christians. This is sort of his culmination, right? His good news for all the world, proclaimed out of his own personal experience of God's grace, right? And so we get his testimony, his defense of the gospel, his presentation of the good news.
Deanna, if these people have not found anything wrong with them, if a person asks to see Caesar or appeals to Caesar, is that by law they have to let him do that?
So that's not quite known. The appealing to Caesar if you were charged with something and you wanted to stop the trial and instead have it go to Caesar, was the right of every Roman citizen. But then Caesar got tired of hearing the Caesars over the years. It was a pattern that they were tired of hearing all of these cases, and they added restrictions. We know there were restrictions. We don't know the details of what the restrictions were. So that, you know, and that there may be future research that fills in more of that information, but we don't have that, like, we don't have sources that say what the restrictions were. And that may be why Festus had to stop and consult with his counselors to say, like, does this qualify or not? Other questions or thoughts?
I'm sorry, I was having to make some notes, but are you at the bottom? On verse 32, and I don't know if you're there yet.
Yeah, go ahead.
It says, Agrippa said to Festus, because this is after everything was over and they're back in the little corner talking to each other. And it says, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. I don't know what that means and why. Well, could you explain that, please?
So the logic of it is different than the drama of it, right? So two things. So the logic of it is they say, like, the Jews don't have a legitimate charge against Paul. And over the course of these, you know, the Sanhedrin, Felix, Festus, Agrippa, we've been seeing over and over again that for justice to be served is for Paul to be acquitted, right? There's no justice in continuing to charge Paul with death, like being deserving of death is what they keep saying. And so the message is like that there's an injustice here that we could acquit it. Okay. But the drama of it is all along we've known this. They could have acquitted him anywhere along the line. And it seems to be that they knew it too, right? They concluded as if, well, it's not our fault. He appealed to Caesar, so I guess to Caesar he will go. If he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we would let him go. But would they? Because they didn't.
No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't have let him go.
Not because they were trying to appeal to those that had charged him.
They're trying to play all sides, trying to use it as a political, you know, to have the situation work out politically in their favor. And so this statement of their justice comes too late, right? And there's the drama in it, is that yes, they could have let him go, but if they were going to, I guess they already would have.
Had him there for 2 years.
Yeah, and more.
But if they let him go, they would have killed him.
The Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, they certainly were on a mission too, right? Oh, did those same ones that swore not to eat or drink anything, did they die of thirst, or did they come back and eat and drink something and get a
Surely
now, and now they've got another chance, right?
They ate at some point. They couldn't keep
Never told, but I would assume, yeah, I would guess, yeah. So I mean, you get this sort of like this, the miscarriage of justice is really highlighted, isn't it? Because they say to themselves, oh, this isn't just, but it's not our fault. But meanwhile, the justice is not executed. They find him innocent, and yet they keep him. Yeah. Just as Jesus, right? Found innocent and yet executed.
I just have to say that what Sharon just pointed out, that last verse, it just has the drama of like a Shakespearean play, you know, of the Romans over here, and these two guys over here just, you know, like, yeah, he shouldn't have, if he would have let go, but you know, we can't let him go. It's so dramatic.
It is. It really is. Yeah, and we really get this. There's such a pinnacle of the message here too, right at this pinnacle of this message, right, is when this happens. Because look what Paul, the whole thing is about for Paul. This is all about the hope of Israel, right? Everything in God's plan was in the prophets, right? Everything for understanding, everything that pointed to the hope of Israel was in the prophets. He says, do you believe in the prophets? I know you do. He says, God has always pointed to a light, he says in verse 23, would rise from the dead and proclaim light to his own people and to the Gentiles. So that this message, this good news of light from Jesus Christ has always been in God's plan. He says the resurrection having happened in Jesus has provided hope for the resurrection for all believers. And everything he says is about the hope of Israel. I stand here on trial for the hope of Israel. And then we get Agrippa, do you suppose you'll persuade me to be a Christian?
Oh, yeah.
And this final statement, short time or long, I pray that not only you, but all who are listening to me today, this is the hope of Israel, right? This was what God was always doing in Israel. All who are listening to me today become what I am, someone who trusts in Jesus Christ, except for these chains. Right, so we get Paul's complete, like this message here, even just in this response to, do you think I'm going to become a Christian? We get, it's for everyone. I hope, as God has provided the hope, that it is for everyone. In a lot of ways, this is a climactic point in Acts, all of this drama. And from here, we're going to move into the narrative of his journey to Rome and his final, where we leave Paul in Rome in the end. And so we'll stop here. We'll pick up that journey to Rome next week. We'll go all the way, we go halfway through, do 27 and 28, halfway through 28 to 28:16, I think. Paul's journey to Rome. But the final, this is the biggest speech. You know, he makes some smaller speech later, but this is the biggest speech that says the message of Jesus for everyone. Thank you all for a good lesson today. We'll adjourn there.
Thank you, Deanna.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, I want to mention something that the Bible that I'm using, which shows Josephus stated that 20 years later, Drusilla and her only child died at Pompeii, and many people know about Pompeii. And it's
Interesting. I did not come across that. That's very interesting.
the historical accuracy of, you know, this person who was in the Bible. Josephus stated, you know, died in Pompeii, which is very sad, but that was her life.
Thank you.
Oh, I would like for somebody to introduce me to this lovely lady. Her face is familiar, but her name threw me. I want to meet Claudia. I'm used to calling